Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on Free Our Feeds, a path to build open public service social media. Some housekeeping points to begin with. Some of you will probably have seen the call for proposals for the EU DisinfoLab Conference 2025 is open. You can find out more on disinfo.eu/conference. The conference this year takes place on the 15th and 16th of October in Ljubljana. As you will have noticed, this webinar is recorded, and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel shortly. And all of our previous webinars are there too, if you want to go back in time and see what we've been talking about. On your screen, you will see the QR code for Slido. Slido is used for the questions and answers, and not the Zoom Q&A. You access this by scanning the QR code or by going to slido.com and entering the code #disinfo. We'll start with two short polls. Where are you joining from and which sector do you represent? In Slido, you can submit questions for our speaker at any time during the event, and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. For those of you who are not familiar with EU DisinfoLab, we are a not-for-profit organization gathering information and expertise in disinformation in Europe. We organize these webinars to give voice to experts in our amazing community and to help share knowledge and raise awareness around the great work that has been done by many people in the fight against disinformation. As I mentioned, today's topic is if and how we can break free from toxic social media recommender systems that drive controversy, conflict, and confusion, because this generates more engagement than data used and data that can be used and abused for commercial and political purposes. We're delighted to have Robert Berjon speaking today. Robin is a technologist specializing in governance of digital tech. He is Deputy Director of the IPFS Foundation. He previously was Vice President of Data Governance at the New York Times, where he worked on privacy and safeguarding media independence, and Vice Chair of the Board of the World Wide Web Consortium. His work focuses on building durable democratic governance of technology so that our digital sphere can start operating in the public interest on a planetary scale. This is a webinar that I personally have been looking forward to for some time. So I will now stop talking and hand over to Robin for his presentation. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Joe. Hi to the person who is joining us from their volcano. I assume that's some kind of underground lair. It's great to be here. I'm gonna start sharing my presentation with the traditional question. Does everyone see this? And I'm not hearing anyone, so I assume the answer. Yes, thank you, Joe. So hi, everyone. As you know, I'm going to be talking about social media today, and the goal of this presentation is to show that a different path to the one that we've been traveling on over the past couple of decades is not only possible but within reach, and that there's ongoing work to make it happen, and that there's reasons for hope. So amid all the darkness that we're all seeing today in the world, I think there is a path forward, and there's reasons to be hopeful. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing the current situation. I think everyone's on this call is keenly aware of the many issues with the social web, with social media in general. Today, it's not a good place by any measure, even though it does have some attractiveness to it, which is why we choose to spend some time there. But overall, it is in a pretty sorry state. Why is it in a sorry state? However, what are the driving issues that make it so spectacularly bad? I think we can, of course, talk about many contributing factors, and they exist, but I want to focus on two that I think are particularly important because they are the two that, in my mind, give us a path forward. If we can solve these two issues, then I do think we can fix the others. Not by magic, nothing gets, there's no utopian perfect future, but we can get to something that is as messy and dysfunctional as democracy should be, and that is a pretty good place to be landing in. Those two issues that I see are, on the one hand, monoculture, particularly algorithmic monoculture. We're really existing in a system in which there exists only a very limited set of influences, a very limited set of people who decide how the information environment is structured, and that is necessarily bad when you impoverish a complex system such as society, social opinion, in such a way you cannot possibly get good outcomes. And the other, the second issue that I think is foundational is the problem of captured infrastructure. And we'll get into greater detail as to what I mean by infrastructure here. But I think it's really important to understand that it doesn't have to work this way. The same technical systems can be operated with different governance, and can be built and deployed in the public interest. What we're really seeing here is a case of capture. Capture is the use of public systems for private interest, and again, similar to monoculture, it never does any good. So, but let's jump into looking at these two issues in turn, and specifically at how we can think about solving them. So, an important thing to do in my mind when dealing with digital systems is to always refer to non-technology, to common experience that we have with other types of systems with the non-digital world. The reason for that is because even if we don't mean to, we all tend to suffer from a form of tech exceptionalism. We all tend to shift to a different mode of thinking when we deal with digital systems, instead of seeing that the structures that we're dealing with are very similar to structures that we've dealt with before and for which we have solutions. And so in my mind, that's absolutely the case when we think of recommender systems and, broadly understood, any kind of algorithm that ranks what you get to see, be it in search or in social. At the end of the day, if we look at these media systems, they're not different from traditional media in any meaningful way. You have an automation of the system, but structurally, what these systems do is they source information, they filter it, and then they rank it. And that is editorial decision making of the same kind that, say, a newspaper will be carrying out, right? You will have people who will be sourcing that information, maybe through submissions, maybe by having reporters in the field. It completely depends on the kind of media, but there is always a sourcing function. There's a filtering function. Is this newsworthy? Is this the kind of thing we publish? Or that in this case could be simply content moderation, deciding not to have things published at all. And then there's ranking. Is it boosted in the feed? Is it at the top of the search results, et cetera, et cetera? And this is an editorial system that is automated, but this automation does not change the nature of the process. And when we speak of algorithms, we tend to naturalize the process as if algorithms had some kind of mathematical, scientific, perfect logic that decided ranking and that carried out editorial processes in a way that was unbiased and somehow naturalized. But that's not true. An algorithm is just someone's opinion that has been transcribed into code. And so an editorial decision made by algorithm is just one step removed from an editorial decision making at any other kind of publication. So with that in mind, we can immediately understand that the same kind of solution that we would apply in traditional media might be brought to bear for the kind of issues of algorithmic monoculture that we're seeing in the digital space. And indeed, it's certainly true that you wouldn't have just one newspaper. That's not how you would want to structure a democratic society. And same for TV channels, same for what have you, right? This is not to say that the DSA is a bad idea, but it's probably not the perfect solution, or at least it's definitely not the only component in the solution for social media issues. If you had only one newspaper, the best solution wouldn't be to regulate it and figure out a way of like getting transparency reports out of it and ensuring that its coverage meets certain barriers, certain requirements that you would expect from a newspaper, but that they would never perfectly reach, or that they certainly would never exceed. What you would want is to foster, media pluralism and a diversity of news sources. And that is exactly what the approach based on algorithmic pluralism is seeking to do. How does that help? Let's assume we translate to a world in which we have an algorithmically plural, and I'm sorry this term is like technical and annoying, and it's not great marketing, but it is the technical term for it. What would that change if we accomplish this? Well, again, looking at the real world, it's the pre-digital world. It's a question of figuring out what the amplification factors are. In a democracy, you're rarely worried about content production or publishing, right? It's always been the case that if you want to write something crazy on a sheet of paper and hand it around to 5 friends, that's always been possible. If you want to call everyone you know and tell them about some news, that is also possible. The thing is, there traditionally was a highly polycentric system of filters and levels that you would reach before you get amplified to any significant group of people. So you might have your own personal newsletter, you might have a soapbox on the public square. You might write in the local newspaper or go on the local TV channel, etc., etc. And the thing is, like, amplification did happen. And it happened with all kinds of problematic gatekeeping. There's no question that the previous system was imperfect, but it happened in a way that there were many checks and balances, right? Maybe you would get amplified by one source, but all the other sources might question that, and you got a lot of different levels of decision involved, and the potential for pushback. And essentially, this highly plural and multi-scale system helped to deneutralize positions. Like, you picked a newspaper based on its politics, you knew what biases you were buying into. It might not help, but at least you knew what you were getting. There was no pretense that it was a somehow neutral position. You also like prevented a lot of invasion by, some types of ideas that couldn't spread everywhere because the editorial decision making had to be made again and again and again. And therefore, unlike this monoculture where if you have like one viral thing, it can invade everything because it's all the same species. In a much more plural world, it's a lot harder for something to go truly viral beyond a few, pockets of contagion, essentially. In general, it also disperses power over speech and over filtering. And as a rule, diversity, epistemic diversity, so diversities of viewpoints, is core to democracy and resilience. And pluralizing editorial decisions is absolutely part of that. The other side of the equation is this question of captured infrastructure and how we replace captured infrastructure with open and public infrastructure. The shift here in terms of how I think we need to think about this is to stop thinking of social media as consumer products. A lot of the digital space we look at as consumer products. And the problem is, if you think of the issues you're getting as issues related to consumer products, then there aren't really any options other than safety regulation, which is how we've long dealt with consumer products in the first place. Like, if they're terribly dangerous, you just ban them. Otherwise, you create standards for all kinds of, safety and safety regulations that control how they're produced and how they can be distributed, maybe who they can be distributed to. But That's the wrong angle from which to understand social media and a whole number of other digital systems. They're not consumer products. They have a consumer-facing interface, but at heart, they go much deeper than that. They are infrastructural. And once we start thinking in terms of infrastructure, we first have to ask, okay, what makes something infrastructure? We used to, infrastructure being like big bulky things that we can touch, a road system, an electric grid, maybe a dam or like a sewage system. It's less visible, but it's there, and it's very physical and large, right? So switching to digital infrastructure, the first thing that people start to think about is data centers and maybe connectivity, and then they tend to stop there. But that's incorrect. If you want to think about infrastructure, it's important to start from a definition of the criteria, to start from the criteria that make something infrastructural. What makes a given system infrastructure in society? The first criterion is that it has to be something that's difficult to replace. Of course, like the road network is hard to replace. Like if tomorrow I want to make a second road network, it's going to be difficult to overlay it on top of the existing one. But also other things can make a system hard to replace. So for instance, network effects. If you have a two-sided system, everyone needs to move at the same time. Otherwise, the moving doesn't work. So it's very difficult to replace that system if everyone has to coordinate with everyone else to leave it at the same time. Second, that system needs to have a great diversity of users. Why? Because if it's only a system that's used for one purpose, then the people who need that single purpose can much more easily collaborate and cooperate and coordinate their action in order to have political power over that system. Whereas if it has a great diversity of users, for instance, again, the road system is a great example. You can use it for tourism, you can use it for merchandise, you can use it for cars or public transportation or bikes or whatever. Then you have something where it's difficult to get all those constituencies to get together, align on a position, and push back for something. And so the diversity of users tends to disperse the power of the people who use that system. And third, you need that system to have power over its users. If it doesn't have power over its users, then it really doesn't matter. It doesn't have like infrastructural effect on society because you can just decide to ignore it. And so with these three criteria put together, any system that matches them has to be considered infrastructure. And once you do that, you start to notice that a lot of the digital world is actually infrastructural, and deeply so. On the positive side, even though that's a lot of infrastructure and therefore difficult problems, thinking about them in this way opens up new ways of solving infrastructure-related problems in the digital space, because we can use, again, solutions that we applied to regulate everything from sewage to train networks to the digital space, and also to not just regulate, but also provide alternatives. And so basically figuring out how to operate public interest infrastructure is the way that we can make the digital world work for us. It's a big problem. As I said, once you start looking at the digital space in terms of infrastructure, then you get a very, very long list of things, as you can see in the bottom diagram there. That's a very high level diagram, and already you can see a lot of those like flying icons. Each of those is an area that needs its own infrastructure set, and it probably will need to be broken down into pieces that have yet more infrastructural components. So it's large, but it's not particularly hard or necessarily particularly expensive to carry out and to build these alternatives. And as one example, specifically in the social media space, I've been working as part of a project called Free Our Feeds. And what we're doing is we're raising funds in order to start a foundation that will operate social media infrastructure. And I'll get into more detail as to what that means specifically, but we want to operate public interest social media infrastructure to provide the kind of countervailing power in social media networks that can keep them open and that can keep them operating in the public interest with algorithmic plurality on top. One thing that's important to understand is that making building something and deploying something that operates in the public interest doesn't mean it necessarily has to be done by the state. There are many things that are public, but not necessarily state-based. However, it would definitely help to have state support for this kind of project, especially to get them off the ground. So I do believe that this is a whole of society sort of project that needs, you know, relatively broad mobilization. But again, it's not necessarily it's definitely not out of reach. It's very much feasible if we approach it right. So how do we go about, you know, thinking replacing the current captured infrastructure with public interest one? Well, we need to be thinking about three aspects of the problem: tech, funding, and governance. If you only solve for one, you know, a lot of the time I have people come to me and say, hey, why don't we just open source it and then we'll be fine? That doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't give you funding, it doesn't give you governance, it just gives you a piece of technology that people have access to. Which isn't to say that open source isn't great. It's wonderful for many things. It's just not enough. We have to think beyond the make it open and magic happens kind of approach, right? And so on the tech side, we need to think about the technical architectures of what we build for each of these silos, and specifically for social media, in terms of capture resistance and in terms of democratic governance. This means thinking about the ways in which, when you deploy a specific architecture in the world, it could be captured by by private interests, and thinking about ways in which you can disperse power and give the stakeholders using the system some power and some control over how it works. Second, in terms of funding, ensuring continued provision of infrastructure is always hard. Essentially, one of the very few. I mean, there's a small toolbox from pre-digital systems that we have that has essentially been primarily been taxation and forms of regulated monopolies. I think we can try a few other things in the digital space, but we definitely need to structure these components with a way of capturing enough value that they can keep operating, but with enough checks and balances, of course, that they don't start capturing all the value for themselves, as we see today with the private systems that we have. And finally, for governance, governance is always hard no matter what you do, but I think we can really address the problem here by breaking down these problems into manageable, smaller manageable units. I'll give an example of that afterwards, but essentially, if you think of a body to govern social media, that seems insanely big, insanely hard, and it is. No one should have that kind of power. No one has the capacity to do that well. But if you break what we think of as social media, again, which tends to be seen as a monolith when it's made of a lot of different components, if you break it into separate components, then you can figure out governance that makes sense within those islands. And I'll give an example of that afterwards. So I've managed to speak for about 20 minutes about this issue without talking about any of the specific pieces of technology that are involved. Some people use @protocol. That's the protocol that's underlying Blue Sky and other novel projects. Some people talk about the Fediverse and ActivityPub. ActivityPub is a W3C standard. The Fediverse is that plus Mastodon plus a whole bunch of other things like that. And there are other emerging open new social media, new social web systems like Nostr or DSNP, etc. And first it seems a bit confusing to have all of these, and then people tend to have very strong opinions about which one you should pick without really understanding the architecture of each of them and the trade-offs involved as deeply as potentially desirable. The point I'm making here is that these can actually work together. What we need is systems that are capture resistant, and capture resistance is hard. And we can actually build a system that uses good components from @protocol, good components from ActivityPub, inspiration from maybe some of the others, use DSNP for this part. We can actually make these things work together. It's not important to pick one. No one needs to jump on this and go like, oh, I'm team whatever activity pub and all the other people are the bad people. No, that's unhelpful, and it just makes the incumbents stronger. Instead, we can look at each and see the contributions it brings and see how to make them work together. And Free of Feeds actually already has projects underway collaborating with DSNP and working on at protocol activity pub evolution and convergence. So really, we don't need to, this is not like a religious war. We really don't need to go into fighting between these different protocols. What's important to think of is that they all have interesting properties to bring to the table in terms of the decentralization, of democratization, and we can keep building systems that are imperfect but that bring to bear these various interesting parts together to make them stronger. And so this, if you're not technical, this next slide is going to be a little bit scary. It's a diagram of how Blue Sky and the AT protocol currently work, but I wanted to use it to illustrate the point I was making earlier about how splitting social media into smaller components makes it manageable from a governance perspective. And I think Blue Sky has done a great work of actually exemplifying how to make that work in the real world in a way that has very nice capture resistance properties. And so I won't go into detail, and it, if you don't understand the acronyms and all that, don't worry about it. That's perfectly fine. But just to give you an idea, if you look at the top left, actually the entire vertical left there, there's a bunch of things called PDSs, and those are personal data servers. And those are structured so that a given person can easily switch from one to another and can take all their followers and all their data with them at any time with essentially the step of a finger. And so the governance of PDSs becomes essentially enforcing the fact that these people can simply move from one to the other, and then making it easy to move between PDSs. Then you don't need to worry about a lot of the other things that a PDS might do, because people can simply hop to another. And so essentially, by breaking down that part of social media, which is essentially the storage, identity related storage component, you've made it a manageable space on its own that no global social media organization needs to control over. Then if you move slightly to the right, you see something called a relay. That is a component that sees essentially the entirety of the network and makes it possible to find people you haven't seen, to see posts that are not related to you, et cetera, and to generate feeds and to generate content moderation, labelers, et cetera, et cetera. And again, that is a very, it's a whole of network property. And you can define governance for just that. Okay, what is a good relay? What inputs should it accept? What limited content moderation does it need to be? What agreements does it need to abide by in terms of the fire hose it produces? And that's it. You don't need to govern everything. There are specific parties who have an interest in making it work well. And so you can basically bring stakeholders into a room to agree on how it should operate and to essentially pay for it. And again, break down that. It doesn't need to be governed in relationship to the PDSs, and it doesn't need to be governed in relationship to anything that's downstream of it. I won't go through the entire diagram because I think you get the idea, but basically this entire diagram that you're looking at right now is how social media works. It's an architecture of social media, and it is broken down in components that can individually have manageable governance. So now I've been talking in the abstract about political principles and technical principles, etc. I just want to give a few examples of how this works in the real world. The examples I'm using come essentially from the AT protocol and Blue Sky that's built on top of it, primarily because they've implemented a lot of these features, but it doesn't mean that it's specific to this protocol. They're just very convenient real world examples. And so very quickly, feeds. You can have, because the fire hose is open, because the relay is open, you can have feeds of any type. I myself subscribe to about 20. and they each can have their own algorithmic choices, their own filtering, their own sourcing, etc. And so this makes it very easy to source information from a diversity of sources. And it's quite powerful. It's very easy to make your own feed. There are now systems that actually help even non-technical people just with a few clicks and things like that generate their own feed. And so there are tens of thousands, I think, now available. And you can subscribe to them, which shows the potential of algorithmic pluralism, even though I think it goes well beyond just having a list of feeds. We can certainly build more than that, but that's a start. It's right there, and 30 million people are using it. Moderation is also part of it. Instead of having a single service that has to do moderation for everyone, and you have to figure out what the right rules are for billions of users. Well, here you can have a core service that does very basic moderation that people might want, and then you can overlay any kind of system on top of it. And this also works because the system has been broken into components such that if tomorrow I want to create my own content moderation system, and maybe I get financed by a nonprofit to run it, or maybe people will pay me because mine is better, I can do so and ship it. Or if I want to organize with like 5 of my friends who are really annoyed by specific people in our very specific community, I can create like a content moderation module just for us, with block lists and labels and what have you, that everyone in our group can contribute to and subscribe to. And so this gives you a lot of flexibility. And it's sort of like it's the filtering version of algorithmic pluralism, right? You have algorithmic pluralism in generating sources of relevance that create feeds, and you have the same thing in terms of filtering, in terms of what I don't want to see, what I want blocked from my personal timeline. And these compose as much as you want. One interesting project that we're looking at is notably moderation for currently underserved languages. It's known from transparency reporting that some languages get a lot of content moderation and some languages get almost none. And I think with this kind of composable system where everyone can bring their own and offer their own content moderation, it becomes possible to create new services for underserved languages. This is a small thing, but it's turned out to be very popular in traditional social media, the closed kind. Normally, you get recommendations for users that are generated by the system itself because it's essentially trying to push specific people to you. Here, you can have starter packs where basically anyone can create a recommended list of people to follow and share it, and off you go. And so it's a way of promoting a different type of relevance, a more plural approach to relevance. And finally, this is more future oriented. It's not something that we've seen in the wild yet, but I think is very promising, is precisely because of this architecture that split the sources apart, but also makes it possible to replace specific parts of the architecture of the social media monolith. You can imagine indexing the entire activity of a given social media system and exposing interesting types of search, interesting types of content mining, social research in ways that's not gated by a platform. This comes with a lot of potential problems, of course, because research can be abused in many ways, but it also comes with promise. So it's not an unadulterated good and necessarily a fully positive step forward, but it's nevertheless a significant change that will have an impact and that will also have good consequences. And with that in mind, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I think we'll now be switching to questions.
Can you turn off your presenting mode, please? Thank you.
Yeah, it should be off now.
Okay. Well, I had a whole list of questions in my head to ask, but so apparently did our viewers. So I'll start with 2 viewer questions. Firstly, how do you see the potential for decentralized social media in the combating of propaganda in times of war, where narratives are heavily manipulated by various actors?
I mean, that's always going to be challenging no matter what, but I do think that um, uh, having algorithmic pluralism makes it harder for actors to manipulate the entirety of the system. Of course, if you keep subscribing to like a narrow set of feeds and sources, then those can be manipulated, but you also have the ability to broaden quite easily. And I think one factor that is a source of great resilience in this kind with this kind of problem is that a lot of people want to subscribe to interest-specific feeds, right? They're not going like, oh, I want like the government media or I want that political party's media. They're also like, I want a feed about knitting or I want a feed about dinosaurs or whatever. And because those feeds tend to be imperfect, you don't just get knitting in the knitting feed, you don't just get dinosaurs in the dinosaur feeds. You tend to have like some kind of permeability of information, and the fact that you are getting multiple narratives provided to you at once tends, I think, this is not something I've studied, right? We're only at the beginning of people studying interventions with these algorithmic pluralism systems. But I think there's reasons to believe that a more diverse ecosystem makes it harder to manipulate narratives.
Thank you. While we're working towards achieving these goals, what do you think that we as users or governments could do to battle the organized influence of public perception of the monoliths like X and Instagram?
I'm going to be a bit more blunt and definitive than I usually am here, but I don't think it's worth trying. The reason for that is because you can't win. There's nothing you can do that can beat an algorithm that's working against you. It can all, the owners of these platforms can always make sure that you are not heard. They can always make sure that you are not amplified. They can always make sure that you lose any attempt at any kind of, public influence through channels that they own, and that they are, very direct in using to manipulate people. Does it mean giving up? I don't necessarily think so, but I think there's very little that we can do by participating on these platforms to do anything there. I think organizing people to leave and to switch is ultimately and very, very quickly the only way forward. Sorry to be a bit defeatist on that, but it's just not, you just can't beat a system that you have no control over.
You raised some very interesting questions at the beginning of the presentation as regards editorial control. If the social media platforms, and particularly the new infrastructure that you envisage, were considered editors along the lines that you seem to imply, would that create a barrier to entry? Because in the current situation, you're not liable. The platform isn't liable because they're not the editor. There was a related question on the DSA that I was riffing from. So the original question was, do you think this type of architecture would facilitate DSA compliance? So my question was kind of the opposite. Would it prevent DSA compliance?
That is a particularly difficult question to answer, because essentially most of the legal most of the digital regulation that we've built over the past decade or so does not take decentralized systems into account at all. It's the same problem with the GDPR. You assume a controller, and the notion of controller becomes very diffuse based on how a given protocol is implemented. However, I do think it's manageable. So yes, as a person generating a feed needs to be to some degree responsible for that feed because they make amplification decisions, and so that could scare some people. At the same time, I think taking into account the size of the actor, the money they make, the number of users they have, et cetera, should make things relatively simpler. So you have to account for like things that are just linking. Like on my blog, if I link to a source and it turns out that that is defamatory or problematic in other ways, to what degree am I liable? I would hope not too much. I think these problems are manageable with a common sense application of regulation or common sense lightweight modifications thereof. I don't think we have to immediately jump into the scenario of a person who, you know, is experimenting with a feed that has 5 users and from which they make no money, and somehow that feed spreads something it shouldn't have. We need to be reasonable in how we approach the application.
So there's another question that is similar to one that I was thinking of, which is how to sustain such infrastructure. Where would the revenue be available for every stack layer? What's the incentive? Or if I could rephrase that slightly, or add my own thoughts to that. In the liberalization of European telecommunications, we had monolithic operators that came with certain disadvantages, and the question was asked, what could we do with competitors that were working from the same infrastructure, and how do we open the market? And we in the EU seem, in my opinion, did that very well. So do you think that opening the market in this way would create new ways to sustain the infrastructure, and do you think there's a inspiration to be had from past experience?
Yeah, I definitely think we should learn from past experience in terms of not just having revenue flow to whatever is user facing, but also having what's user facing pay for its own infrastructure along the way. I think there are multiple models that we can consider to make this work. I'm not saying that I have like it 100% solved, but it is definitely a high priority for the FreeRFeeds project. So we can think of multiple ways that the client, the user facing side can make money. Maybe it's through subscription, maybe it's through advertising, maybe it's through like some kind of like crazy crypto scheme. It doesn't matter, but they then have to pay for the infrastructure that they use. And that essentially has like value flowing through the system itself. There's a number of ways in which we can also imagine participants in these networks getting together, in a cooperative form. So basically, maybe a co-op of relays or whatever, and owning enough of the market that they perceive a small, essentially, taxation on transactions that go through it. And we could make sure, of course, that the people who rely on those systems to use them have a vote in how they operate as part of like how, notably how much of them how much money do they need to pay into it to make it work. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of prior art on this. Picking the right one is challenging, but we're working on it, and I know we can make it function. The one thing I would like to avoid is or move away from is the current system in the Fediverse where you have volunteers who are spinning up instances and then have to collect funds just to keep them on because it is expensive to operate, and then burn out doing their own content moderation or doing their own maintenance. It's often way too hard, and then people lose their accounts, they lose their data. So we have to find something, we have to build something that's much more reliable than that. But the experience with the Fediverse and with prior systems actually helps us pick better options.
Do you think that there's a risk that any significant change of this nature could be interpreted as a government power grab? And what could we do to prevent this if you think it is a risk?
I mean, it's a risk if the government actually does a power grab. Um, I do think having public, again, as I said during the talk, having a public interest system is different from having a publicly owned system. And so I think governments can intervene in order to help public interest systems emerge, but not necessarily operate them. Um, if and when they do operate them, I think they should be operated essentially as public options. So again, reusing from prior utilities regulation, you can have a public option that is essentially the baseline competitor, and everyone you force the rest of the market to act better. At least that's the theory. Um, so I mean, if the question is perception of power grab, I think that's a question of communicating better. If it's actual power grab, that's a question of democratic checks and balances.
And I'll phrase one of the questions in two ways. So, how do you see such an infrastructure approach giving more power to users and content creators, or conversely, how much do you see users and content creators losing over the past 2 or 3 decades from the absence of such a model?
Um, I mean, I think it's hard to even understand how much we've lost from the absence of such a model. One thing that I find the most striking with people who are switching to these new open public interest social media systems is how challenging it is at first for many users who are otherwise, competent, intelligent people, how hard it is for them to regain agency. We've all grown so used to systems that decide everything for us that when confronted with a system where we actually have choices and the ability to make our own decisions, we don't really know what to do. And I see people who are like, I don't know who to follow. The system isn't pushing anyone on me. It's just like, well, look for your friends and look for their friends and look for starter packs, whatever. Or like, my feed is empty. What should I do? Well, look for other feeds, follow more people. And so just like regaining essential agency is challenging. Um, in terms of giving people more power, be they users or content creators, absolutely yes. Yes, in terms of deciding what they see and what they read, but also like you can come up with all kinds of your own rules. You could have a feed that you use that shuts off after, I don't know, 9 p.m. because you've decided you want to give yourself a cutoff and your feed becomes empty. You can, as a content creator, you can first use feeds as a medium itself of creation, but also because these protocols are extensible, we're starting to see new ways of using social media that don't need to go through a big company to work and can reuse this shared infrastructure to create new, essentially entirely new social apps, entirely new interactions. So yes, it's going to be, it's giving, and it's going to give a lot more powers to users and content creators, no doubt about that.
So you just referred to some of the challenges to moving away from the current infrastructure. What do you see as the other main challenges that we face?
Um, there are quite a few. I mean, of course, one is like changing habits. Some people, it's very hard to move people into new habits, no matter how much they want to. And so, someone who's used to using one system, even if they hate it, the idea of taking steps to go somewhere else can be challenging. One of the things I did on my phone is I just like removed Twitter entirely, and I replaced it. I replaced the icon exactly in the same place with a new with a new social media, and that really helped you use the habits to transition. More generally, one particularly hard challenge is that these systems don't exist in a vacuum, where they exist in a complete system in which essentially all of our digital infrastructure is captured, and that includes ways of being found through search, it includes browsers, it includes app stores, it includes operating systems, etc., etc. And so just like rebuilding only social media is very difficult. We can push forward in social media because there's a breach right now that we can use, but we need to get the entirety of the rest of digital infrastructure also operating in the public interest. Otherwise, there's just too much pressure, too much points of control from other infrastructural systems that social itself relies on, and you know, basically the people who operate those could claw their way back into power if we only get social media back. So we have to do everything. Again, it's not. It sounds like a lot, but it's not. It's not at all impossible.
So an interesting question was just posed. How do we make it sexy to persuade people to move from toxic monolithic structures to open democratic structures where you can speak your own mind?
It's already sexy. I mean, like, I mean, the question mentions Blue Sky. 30 million people have switched there, and it's a very lively community. Personally, like the areas that I care about cover, philosophy, books, big parts of big chunks of science and technology, a number of things like that. All those entire communities of scholars, of journalists, of technologists have switched over. And so as far as I'm concerned, for that specific usage, it's already there. Now, of course, anonymous questioner, I'm sure if you were to join, you would also make it even better. But I think what we're missing is some formats that people prefer. So, Blue Sky is great if what you loved was Twitter and you want to switch to something else. The question of like what people who like Facebook or Instagram, etc., should switch to is different. Some people are switching from Instagram to pixel fed. Other people are working on novel Insta alternatives, novel TikTok alternatives. I think the biggest thing that one could do is build these alternatives. But once they're built, like go there, post content, invite people over and leave the old places as much as you can.
I think we need a second hour to go through all of the points that you raised. If I can bundle the remaining two questions asked through the audience into one, do you think if we're dividing up into different infrastructure elements, if we're going to create siloed, even angrier voices in separate systems that self select, and do you have thoughts about bridges in the infrastructure discussion?
I assume that the bridges is the same thing as like the silo bridging. It's specifically the social bridging thing. Yes, I mean, I'm not worried about algorithmic pluralism creating greater polarization, because I don't think, at least my understanding of how polarization works is not that. And so I really imagine the thing, again, to go back to the example, you have the regular feed of people you follow, and then you have a feed of like for your knitting interests or philosophy or whatever. And the thing is, a lot of the time people get angry when they think they're in a space that's their friendly space. It's like their social space, and they start to see content that they really dislike being pushed to them. So like, that crazy uncle who has like conspiracy theories or some politics you really hate. I think when you're exposed um, to ideas that you might dislike, but from people who you've learned to like in another context, you get a different kind of perception. And so, for instance, your friends from the knitting club or whatever, the dinosaur collectors that you interact with, at some point you might see some politics emerge from there because things always transpire, and you'll probably be more open to it because it happens in a small in a more friendly context. And so I really don't see this as siloing things. At the same time, I think it's absolutely people's right not to be exposed to all kinds of crazy positions. You can look at my block list. I have block lists for like Nazis and stuff. I don't think I'm losing anything from not being exposed to those people. It's not something I need to have. So I think it actually helps, having a more polycentric system actually helps soften polarization, and also having absolute blocks for stuff that you don't want to see, that will make you angry, is also a win.
Thank you, Robin. I have a long list of additional questions that I'd like to ask. We've already come to the end of our time. So I hope everyone found this as interesting and educational as I did. So thank you on behalf of the audience, and thank you to the audience for all of the interesting questions. Just to let you know that the next two webinars are on the 20th of February and 6th of March. 20th of February is Cleaning the Air, Building Trust Against Climate Misinformation, against the Climate Misinformation Storm, with Jody Molyneux from Resolver, a Kroll business. And on the 6th of March, it's Melodies of Malice, Understanding How AI Fuels the Creation and Spread of Extremist Music, with Heron Lopez from Leiden University's Institute of Political Science and the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. So that's all that we have time for. I would provisionally like to imagine that we have a part 2 of this webinar at some stage in the second half of the year to cover everything we didn't cover so far. But in the meantime, I would say thank you again, and have a good afternoon to everyone in the audience.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.